There was a time when I could take down trained operatives with nothing more than a shoelace. These days, I'm getting ticketed by the HOA for having a flower pot near the walkway. Life sure knows how to twist the knife. Folks, look at me now, and just see a quiet man keeping his garden neat. But they don't know what I'm capable of. What happens when you threaten what matters most. This isn't a simple disagreement over neighborhood rules. This is about justice. And it all begins the moment someone knocks on my front door. You're watching QA Stories, and this one's personal. My name is David Peterson, and if you think retiring means you've earned some peace, clearly you've never had to deal with an HOA president who treats the rulebook like a weapon. What started as a peaceful chapter of my life quickly became something else. I thought I was done with battles, done with conflict. Turns out, the battlefield just changed. Instead of boots and bullets, I found myself in a neighborhood war of paperwork, fines, and intimidation. When you threaten someone I love, it doesn't matter what tools I have, I'll find a way to fight back. This story isn't about overgrown lawns or missed payments. It's about a quiet war that came to my doorstep. And the day I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer, 3 years ago, Alina and I settled into Willowbrook thinking we'd discovered a little paradise tucked behind white fences. Neat homes, clean streets, neighbors who smiled and waved. It looked like the perfect retirement dream. Alina, my partner for nearly 2 decades, is an architect with a vision that always leaves me speechless. She poured her heart into the backyard, built flower terraces, designed a fountain by hand, and planned lighting so precise it looked like something out of a catalog. I handled the hands-on stuff, the digging, trimming, and heavy lifting. Neighbors used to compliment how clean and organized our yard looked, how the lawn always seemed to have been done by professionals. What they didn't know was that my sense of order came from 20 years in the military, where even a blade of grass, out of place, could cost lives. That discipline, it stuck with me long after I turned in my uniform. Things took a sharp turn 6 months ago, right after Richard Harrison took over as HOA president. The man before him was an easygoing retired teacher who mostly wanted the trash cans off the curb and the grass trimmed every now and then. Richard, though, he came in like a general preparing for battle, mid-50s, square jaw, stiff posture, definitely some military background there. But where I valued quiet discipline, he brought ego and control. From the moment he was elected, he made it clear that things were going to change his way or not at all. He strutted around the neighborhood with a clipboard like he was patrolling a base, barking rules and citing violations over things like holiday decorations or garden gnomes. It wasn't leadership, it was domination, and something about him and the way he looked at people told me he enjoyed it. At a recent community board meeting, he introduced a batch of new rules that felt less about keeping the neighborhood nice and more about controlling every little detail of our lives. Lawn grass now had to be trimmed below 2.5 inches. Any door repaints had to go through a review panel, conveniently one. He led even flower pots needed pre-approval. The overreach started subtly, almost laughably. Our first citation showed up on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was typed cleanly and stamped like something from a government office. Lawn height exceeds 2.5 inches, it claimed, attaching a $200 penalty. Alina was livid. She grabbed a measuring stick and went straight outside, finding the tallest patch of grass barely touched 3 inches. I paid the fine quietly, thinking it would end the hassle. That only seemed to irritate her more. 2 weeks passed before the next issue came in the mail. This time, they had a problem with our front door. Apparently, its shade was too bright for the neighborhood's agreed palette. The funny part, that rich blue color had been there untouched for 3 years. Yet now, they said it violated aesthetics. And we owed $350. Alina decided it was time to start documenting everything unusual, and there was plenty. She began noticing Carol Jenkins across the street snapping photos of our house at odd hours. Carol, a longtime neighbor in her 50s, had never been particularly involved in HOA activities until Richard stepped into leadership. Suddenly, she was his shadow. Then Alina noticed a new piece of equipment, a camera fixed to a utility pole facing directly at our home. That pole had never had surveillance on it before. Curious, she rang the utility company. They had no records of any recent installations in our area. That moment flipped a switch in me. Surveillance without consent wasn't just invasive, it was unlawful. I decided to upgrade our defenses, though I didn't want to draw attention. I picked up a full home security setup, nothing flashy on the outside, but top-tier hardware. The cameras were crystal clear, infrared-enabled, and strategically placed to cover our house and the nearby street. Late one night, I was tucked away in the garage connecting wires and adjusting live feeds on a rugged laptop. Definitely not something you'd pick up at the local electronics store. Alina found me hunched over the workbench, soldering in silence. She asked what I was up to. I just told her I was taking precautions. She didn't push for answers, but I could tell she wanted them. That's when her eyes landed on something. I'd meant to hide a worn-out photo from my past. In it, I stood in full desert gear, next to a sun-bleached sign that clearly read, Special Forces Operations. She didn't say a word about the photo, but I could tell it shifted something. In the way she looked at me like she was reevaluating who I really was. Richard had always acted oddly around me, though it took time for me to figure out what rubbed me the wrong way. His glances were never casual or dismissive. They were sharp, deliberate, like he was trying to place me in a memory he couldn't quite reach. One day at the mailbox, he caught me off guard with a strange question, asked if I'd ever been stationed overseas. I gave him a vague reply, but his expression tightened, as if that was all the confirmation he needed. Carol's presence became more frequent after that, and I noticed she'd often photograph me while I worked outside. It wasn't random. Her attention always focused on my arms, and that's when I realized she must have noticed the tattoo fint, old, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. The trident was subtle but not anonymous. By week 4, the harassment had escalated to absurd levels. The HOA fined us $750 for allegedly disrupting visual harmony with what they now called excessive garden ornaments. Elena was nearing her limit then, to be honest. So was I, but something told me that confronting Richard head-on wasn't the smart move, not yet. He was poking, testing, studying how I'd react, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he already knew more about me than I'd ever disclosed. That evening, I was in the garage sorting through the growing collection of violation letters, placing them into my old military storage chest, when Elena walked in. She watched me silently for a few moments before asking, almost in a whisper, "David, there's more going on here than you're saying, isn't there?" I looked at her, this woman who'd stayed by my side through years of silence, never once pressing me about the past, about the reasons I sometimes flinched awake. At 3 a.m., reaching for weapons that no longer existed. Why was Richard watching me like he'd seen a ghost? Why did his gaze carry weight? I couldn't quite explain. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA, you know the type. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of them are unbelievable. I thought I'd left all that behind when I left the service. I was wrong. This wasn't just typical neighborhood politics anymore. Things were spinning out of control faster than I'd anticipated, and that should have been my first clue that this was calculated, not clumsy. Richard Harrison wasn't your run-of-the-mill neighborhood busybody. No, this was organized, and Elena and I were clearly the targets. The signs were there, you just had to know how to read them, and I did. I'd spent 20 years interpreting threats most people couldn't even imagine. What was coming next would append everything. It would force me back into a mindset I'd buried long ago. Elena's knack for research ended up being a lot sharper than I expected for someone trained as an architect. She found out that the camera aimed at our home wasn't just sketchy, it was flat out illegal. The utility provider denied installing it, and the city had 0 permit filings for surveillance equipment. She followed the wire and discovered a small DVR unit tucked away in Carol's backyard shed. More disturbing, though, was the realization that Richard had been tracking us with military-level accuracy. He knew my work commute, Elena's remote work days, and even changes in our schedules. Somehow he'd gained access to personal info we hadn't shared. This was no longer about HOA. Funds it had crossed into surveillance and stalking. When Elena brought out all the printouts, charts, and documentation she'd gathered, I couldn't help but admire how thorough she'd been. "David," she said as she laid everything out on the kitchen table, "this isn't random. He's waiting for the right time to do something specific." And then Richard brought in reinforcements. He called them HOA enforcement officers, 2 guys named Max and Jake who looked more like nightclub bouncers than neighborhood staff. Both were in their 30s, all muscle and no warmth. The type you instinctively avoided. From our kitchen window, Elena and I watched as Richard gave them a tour, introducing them to Carol and gesturing toward our home several times. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it was enough. The way they kept looking over made it obvious. This was no longer just a string of annoyances, we had entered dangerous territory. I'd encountered guys like Max and Jake before, usually hired by people who preferred force over law. They weren't here to hand out notices. Overnight, the tone of the harassment shifted from annoying to menacing. A pile of withered flowers was left on our porch, deliberately arranged like a warning. Elena's car was vandalized in a grocery store parking lot, long gouges spelling out crude messages. Trash bags were dumped across our lawn in the middle of the night. We called the police, but they brushed it off as teenage pranks. I knew better. These tactics were meant to instill fear, a textbook psychological operation. Elena, who'd always been steady and fearless, was now glancing over her shoulder when walking to her car. She even asked me twice if we should think about moving. That hit me harder than anything. I noticed Richard watching from his window every time something happened, calmly observing like a conductor watching a symphony of chaos unfold. That Tuesday, I finally acted. I skipped work, told Elena I had errands, and spent the day tailing Richard from a safe distance. I needed to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. What I found confirmed every suspicion. He wasn't just keeping tabs on Usi at help. I saw him meet up with someone unfamiliar, a man in an expensive suit who clearly didn't belong in our quiet suburb. Nervous energy poured off him as he handed Richard a thick folder. They spoke inside Richard's car for nearly an hour. I couldn't hear what was said, but the intensity in their gestures told me enough. This wasn't HOA business. This was a calculated effort, and Alina and I weren't random targets. The attack happened on a Thursday morning. I had an unavoidable meeting downtown with my consulting firm, and Alina would be home alone for most of the day. I felt uneasy about leaving but tried to reassure myself it would be fine. Before leaving, I kissed her and told her to call if anything felt wrong. Still, something gnawed at me like I was walking away from a fire I hadn't spotted yet. Around 10:30, my phone buzzed. It was Alina, Carol, and two guys at the door. Emergency inspection. What do? I turned my car around instantly, but I was deep in city traffic. I might as well have been on the moon. I checked my security feed and watched in real time as things unfolded. Every frame burned into my memory. Carol showed up first, clipboard in hand, with Max and Jake close behind in mismatched security outfits. They claimed someone had submitted an anonymous report about hazardous chemicals in our garage and said they were conducting a safety inspection. Alina, ever trusting and law-abiding, let them in, though her discomfort was obvious. That was her mistake. One I should have anticipated. The moment she opened the door, I knew things were about to spiral. I pushed my car to the limit, ignoring lights, weaving through traffic. What happened in those next few minutes broke me, in ways I hadn't thought possible. They weren't just looking to damage stuff. They were after our peace of mind. They began by destroying her ceramic collection, dozens of pieces she'd made by hand. Then they tore through our photo albums, shredding wedding pictures and scattering memories across the floor. They went into my office and stomped on framed service medals, grinding the glass into the carpet. But the worst came when they reached the garden. They yanked out every flower she'd planted, shattered the custom fountain, and smashed the solar lighting she'd installed with such care. Through the cameras, I could see her pleading with them to stop, tears streaming down her face. But they laughed, enjoying the destruction. Things turned violent when Alina reached for her phone to call the police. Max ripped it from her hands and hurled it against the wall. As she bent to pick up the pieces, Jake shoved her back so hard she slammed into the kitchen counter. "Why are you still here?" Max barked, leaning in so close she couldn't move. "Sell this place and disappear before it gets worse." They boxed her in, using their bulk to intimidate her, pushing her toward the fridge. Then Jake grabbed her shoulders and shook her violently, her head snapping side to side. Carol stood a few feet away, gleefully filming it all. "This is what happens when you ignore the HOA," she sneered. "Next time, maybe you'll listen when we tell you how things work around here." I was 12 minutes out, but it felt like a lifetime. By the time I reached the house, the only thing keeping me steady was adrenaline and instincts I hadn't called on in decades. The front door was wide open, and Elena's crying echoed from inside. Max and Jake were lounging in the wreckage, like they were proud of what they'd done. Carol stood in the corner, still recording the aftermath like a trophy to show Richard. None of them heard me come in. That was their first mistake. Their second was turning their backs to the entrance. Their third was underestimating someone who looked like just another quiet neighbor. I moved through the chaos silently. By the time they realized I was there, it was already over. I reached Max first. One strike behind the knee, just the right spot, and he dropped hard, howling in pain as he clutched his leg. Jake spun toward me, fists up, but I could see his next move. Before he even committed to it, I caught his punch midair and sent an uppercut into his jaw. Clean and precise, enough to shut him down without lasting damage. He collapsed instantly. Carol froze, phone slipping from her hands as the reality of the situation hit her. I tied Max and Jake up with a garden hose, secure and tight. Then I turned to Alina. She was shaking, still crying, but when I asked if she was hurt, she nodded, barely able to speak. I helped her to the couch, the only thing still upright in the room, and stayed by her until she calmed down. "Are you hurt anywhere?" I asked again, scanning her for signs of injury. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "No." "But David, what just happened? Who were those people, and how did you do that?" I looked at the two men on the floor, unconscious but breathing, and then at Carol, who looked like she wished she could disappear through the wall. "Those people made a fatal error," I said, my voice steady. "They crossed a line that should never be crossed. They came after my family, and now they're going to learn why the people I served with called me Vulture." You might be wondering, what does that name mean? Just how much danger is hidden behind David's quiet demeanor? And if someone threatened your loved ones in your own home, how far would you go to protect them? Share your story in the comments. I read every one, because this isn't the end. Not even close. In 20 years as a Navy SEAL, one lesson stayed with me. The most dangerous threat is the one that used to be on your side. Over the next several days, Alina and I began uncovering the full extent of Richard Harrison's plan. What we found chilled me to the core and connected every dot I hadn't wanted to believe. But before we could even process what we'd learned, something happened that changed the entire course of events. It was the moment I stopped being just a retiree trying to live quietly and turned back into someone I thought I'd buried. The truth about who I wasn't, who Richard really was about to be exposed. Elena's relentless research, paired with what I knew from my past, revealed a story both disturbing and strangely logical. Richard had served in the military too, but his exit wasn't clean. His file was littered with vague references and missing documents. The kind of thing you see when people want the truth to stay buried. We found mention of a court-martial, allegations of misconduct, and repeated breaches of protocol that put others at risk. The dates lined up with a mission I remembered all too clearly, a disaster caused by someone inside the unit. Alina spread everything out on our table, her face pale with realization. "David," she said softly, "this isn't some coincidence. He knows who you are." I stared down at the old files, feeling the weight of memory press down like armor. And then, from the unlikeliest source, came the missing piece. Our elderly neighbor stopped by to check on Alina, bringing coffee and concern. During small talk, he said something that froze my blood. He mentioned that when Richard moved into the neighborhood, he'd said he was looking forward to a clean slate, but also made an offhand remark about settling an old grudge with a special forces guy who'd derailed his career. At the time, the neighbor thought nothing of it, but now, the words carried heavy meaning. Alina and I exchanged looks. We both knew. This wasn't harassment. This was personal, carefully planned, and long in the making. And Carol? She wasn't just filming for fun. She was keeping records, extremely detailed ones. Alina managed to retrieve one of her reports through a neighbor who'd quietly turned against the HOA. The file contained long-distance shots of my tattoo, a list of my daily routines, and speculation about my background that hit too close to home. But the worst part was an audio recording, Richard's voice, clear as day, naming me David Vulture Peterson, saying he'd been tracking me for years, waiting to take his revenge. Hearing my old call sign spoken like that hit me harder than I expected, but it also confirmed what I had to do. This needed to end now. I decided to face Richard directly, but I wasn't going to do it in secret. I wanted the entire community to see who they had trusted to lead them. The next HOA board meeting was only days away. Richard would be there, and so would I. Alina wanted to stand by me, but I told her to stay home. This wasn't her fight, not this part. I needed witnesses, not casualties. I spent 2 days gathering every piece of evidence, organizing everything into a presentation that couldn't be denied. I also picked a shirt with sleeves I could roll up easily. I had a feeling I might need more than just documents to make my point. The meeting took place at the community center. Nothing fancy, just folding chairs and fluorescent lights. About 20 homeowners had shown up, along with the 5-member board that answered to Richard. He was mid-speech about neighborhood safety. When I walked in with a laptop and projector, all eyes turned to me as I sat up without saying a word. Richard's face turned 3 shades of red. "Mr. Peterson," he said coldly, "this is a closed meeting. If you have concerns, please submit them through the usual channels." I kept setting up calm and methodical. "Richard," I said, without looking at him, "this is one of those moments when exceptions are warranted." Then I hit play. The room fell silent as the screen lit up with high-resolution footage. The attack on our home. The damage. The threats. The assault. It was undeniable. The horror was etched on every face as they watched the men. Richard had hired brutalized Alina while Carol recorded it all. When the footage ended, Richard tried to speak, but I raised a hand to stop him. "That was my wife," I said, voice like stone, "in our home. Under attack by people Richard brought here." I let the words hang there before continuing. "What you just saw was criminal. Assault, property destruction, coordinated harassment. And before we get into what the law says about this, I think you all deserve to know who your HOA president really is." This was the moment I'd prepared, for I slowly rolled up my sleeve, revealing the Navy SEAL trident tattoo. It was small, faded, but unmistakable. The scars below it needed no explanation. The room stayed completely still as I spoke. I served 20 years in the Navy SEALs. My call sign was Vulture. My missions took me to places most of you will never see on a map. I was trained to find threats and eliminate them. I've never failed a mission. Across the room, Richard looked like he was going to collapse. He clutched the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. And then Carol stood. Her voice trembled as she finally cracked. "Stop pretending, Richard," she shouted. "You knew who he was. The whole time, you said it was payback. You used me." The room exploded into gasps and shouts. I let the chaos roll for a few seconds before cutting through the noise. "Richard Harrison was dishonorably discharged from the Army 15 years ago," I said clearly. "He betrayed his unit, sold intel to enemy forces, and got 2 good men killed. I was the one who exposed him, and everything that's happened to my family these past months. That was his revenge." The room fell into stunned silence again. People were putting it together. They'd been manipulated by someone who'd brought war into their peaceful neighborhood. My demands were simple. Richard would resign immediately, issue a formal apology to every resident he harassed, and repay us for every ounce of damage he'd caused. He would also submit himself to a full investigation, because this wasn't just neighborhood politics anymore. It crossed the line into serious federal offenses. I locked eyes with him. "You have 24 hours, I said flatly. "This is your one chance to handle things the right way. I suggest you take it." He tried to respond, tried to spin it or deny what everyone had. "Josh on, but," his voice cracked, thin and weak, barely a whisper. The same man who'd bullied our community for months looked like he might collapse under the weight of exposure. The look in his eyes said he knew the game was over, And then Alina appeared in the doorway. She hadn't planned to come, but something told her she needed to see the ending for herself. She walked over, calm and composed, standing tall beside me. Her voice rang out clear and sure. I think it's time the truth came out for everyone in this room to finally understand what's really been going on in our neighborhood. She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of the neighbors who were still trying to process what they'd just witnessed. And maybe it's also time to rethink what kind of leadership we've allowed to take root here. So who is David Peterson, really? And what was the real story behind his and Richard's twisted history? Why was a man like Richard so afraid of someone who claimed to be just a quiet, retired veteran? Well, that part of the story is where things really start to unfold. If you've been following this, hit that subscribe button because what comes next will leave you speechless. There are enemies who are obvious, and then there are the ones who feel cornered. And when people feel like they've got nothing left to lose, that's when they're most dangerous. The next 2 days would reveal just how deep Richard's obsession went. Alina and I began piecing everything together, every breadcrumb, every clue, and the truth that emerged was more disturbing than I had ever imagined. He wasn't just trying to ruin our lives, he was trying to erase us before we exposed his past. The final card he played forced me to pull out every skill I'd learned in the darkest corners of the world. Willowbrook wasn't just a sleepy suburb anymore, it was about to become a battleground. And this time no rulebook was going to save anyone. With help from trusted military contacts, we managed to get our hands on partially declassified records. What they revealed shook even me. 15 years earlier, Richard Harrison had held rank as a first lieutenant during an op in Afghanistan, a supposedly low-risk recon mission that turned into a bloodbath. Intel had been leaked, tower routes sold out for 50 grand. The ambush that followed was precise and brutal. 2 of our men didn't make it home. Others, myself included, were left injured, pinned down for hours in hostile territory, with no clean exit route because those had been compromised. 2. Back then, I'd suspected foul play, but I kept my mouth shut until I had something solid. It took months of digging, connecting patterns, decoding signals, and following paper trails no one wanted found. Alina read the court-martial summary like it was a horror novel. Her expression darkened as she took it all in. David, she said quietly, this isn't just betrayal of duty. He went after you, according to the transcript. I was the one who cracked the case wide open. I had pieced together his lies, traced his wire transfers, caught the chatter. Between him and known operatives, I built the case that took him down. And the evidence wasn't just damning, it was irrefutable. Secret payments to accounts overseas. Encrypted calls with hostile players. Locals paid to feed us bad intel. Richard had been living far beyond what his rank and salary could ever explain. It had been an operation-wide betrayal, one that nearly compromised dozens of missions. But it was personal to Heed, pinned me as the reason his life unraveled. Alina found his testimony from the tribunal. Bitter, unapologetic, and venomous. He blamed me for everything. Not the soldiers he got killed. Not the brotherhood he shattered. Just me, the guy who refused to let him get away with it. One line in particular hit Alina hard. She read it aloud, her hands trembling slightly. One day I'll find David Peterson and I'll make him pay for what he did. He thinks he's a hero, I'll show him what real consequences look like. It finally clicked for her. The break-ins, the harassment, the months of mental and emotional warfare, it wasn't random at all. This was personal vengeance for years in the making. Every move Richard made had been part of a long game built around destroying me from the inside out. And then came the retaliation. Richard didn't wait. Within hours of the HOA meeting, he had an attorney on speed dial, not one known for ethics but for spinning stories. The guy started whispering poison into the neighborhood. I was unstable, a threat, a ticking time bomb. With combat trauma, he filed for a restraining order and painted Alina and me as the real villains. It was a clever tactic, prey on suburban fear, twist the truth, make me look like the danger. But he underestimated one thing. Everyone had already seen who he really was. That same weekend, Richard's desperation turned violent. On Saturday night, he sent 6 men to solve the problem for good. This wasn't amateur hour like before. These guys were seasoned, with records long enough to fill filing cabinets. But I'd been listening, monitoring his calls, tracking movement, preparing. Everything I learned during my years of service came back in full force. He wanted it to look like a botched robbery, a tragedy, but I knew better. He wanted us dead, and once he made that choice, there was no turning back. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was war. I spent the whole afternoon turning our house into a fortress. Alarms, traps, fallback positions, everything I'd used overseas, repurposed for a suburban battlefield. Alina wanted to call the police. I told her the truth. By the time help showed up, we'd already be statistics. I walked her through every escape plan, every safe zone, showed her the panic room I'd built under the house, and gave her the short version of self-defense 101. She didn't argue, just listened, eyes fierce with determination. As I checked the emergency radio batteries one last time, she asked, softly, "Are we really ready for this?" Her voice was calm, but I could hear the weight behind her words. I looked at her and nodded. "We don't have a choice. He's made that clear. That night, as the sun disappeared behind the trees and the shadows stretched across the lawn, the silence became sharp, too still, too perfect. I took my place. By the entryway, every motion deliberate, every sense heightened like it used to be on deployment. This wasn't just about defending our home. It was about finishing something that had started 15 years ago in the mountains of a foreign country. Now coming full circle in a suburban cul-de-sac, the dash sack, the first sign came just past midnight. Flicker of movement at the edge of our backyard. I watched through a narrow window, saw the flash of metal as one of them moved toward our side door. They were staggered, moving with the precision of trained men. I let them get closer. I needed them inside, where I controlled the environment. The moment the lock clicked and the first one stepped through, I triggered the diversion. Lights flared, an ear-splitting alarm blared from hidden speakers. Disorientation was my weapon, and it worked. They hesitated, just long enough. That's when I moved. I struck first, clean, controlled, silent. The man who entered was out cold. Before he hit the floor, another charged in behind him, confused and angry. He never saw the tripwire. By the time the others realized this wasn't going according to plan, they were already inside a maze I'd designed. They tried to retreat, but I'd blocked their exits. One of them made it to the back hall right into Elena's trap. She fired a warning shot that shattered a picture frame inches from his face. He dropped his weapon and hit the ground, hands up. For a second, there was silence again. Then the chaos returned. I fought like I had in places no one speaks of. Every move was deliberate, no wasted motion. These weren't just criminals anymore, they were threats to everything I had left. In this world, one after another, they fell. Not dead, but down, immobilized, contained. I made sure of that. I wanted them breathing for the police to question, for the courts to prosecute. When the last one finally collapsed near the kitchen doorway, groaning and dazed, I stood over him with blood on my knuckles and fire in my chest. I didn't feel rage, I felt purpose. It was over. For now, Elena emerged from the safe room, shaken but unhurt. She ran to me and threw her arms around my shoulders, her breath trembling against my neck. Is it done? She whispered. I nodded. Slowly. They're not getting another chance. We called the authorities this time, with undeniable proof. When the officers arrived, they were stunned by the scene. 6 armed men, unconscious, zip-tied, and surrounded by improvised defensive installations. Our home looked like it had been prepped for siege because it had. But the story, the officers heard from us, and from the men themselves, once they came to tie, was enough to trigger a full federal investigation. The fallout came fast. Richard was arrested the next morning. His lawyer tried to spin a new narrative, but the evidence, audio, video, testimony crushed any attempt at denial. Every inch of his plan had been recorded, documented, and exposed. Elena's composure at the press conference was something to behold. She laid it out plainly, the harassment, the attack, the history. She looked straight into the camera and said, this wasn't just about a grudge, this was about justice. And about never letting people like Richard Harrison hide behind fake authority again. The crowd applauded. The HOA board resigned the following day. I never wanted this. I came to Willowbrook to live quietly, to be left alone. But sometimes your past doesn't let go. Sometimes you have to stand up, even when it costs you everything. What Richard forgot was that I'd already lost brothers once. I wasn't going to lose anyone else. Not if I could stop it. This fight was personal, but it was also a warning. No matter how long you run, the truth always catches up, and when it does, you'd better be ready, because some ghosts carry some of them fight back. This is madness. People just tried to end our lives in our own house, Elena said, stopping mid. I turned to face her, the woman who thought she'd married a quiet man with a nut E5, now caught in the middle of a battle she never signed up for. Elena, I told her, my voice firm, I'm not going to let anything happen to you, no matter what it costs. You'll make it through tonight. The assault started at exactly 2 a.m., right when most households are deep asleep. But I wasn't most households. I've been up for hours, tracking their approach with thermal gear her design firm had no idea I owned. 6 men, military precision, loaded weapons, moved in like clockwork. They cut the electricity, disabled the landline, and used jammers to block cell signals. Normally, that would have left us completely exposed. But nothing about our life had been normal since I first put on a SEAL uniform, and these guys were about to learn that I wasn't the kind of target that went down easy. The fight didn't last long, but it was brutal tactical improvisation inside a suburban home that turned into a battlefield. I rigged the garden hose into a near-invisible tripwire, used the fire extinguisher for both cover and counterattack, and turned the carefully planned landscaping into my own shadowed route. The first guy hit the ground hard, tripped on the hose and landed badly. Likely broke something. The second caught a direct hit from the extinguisher's chemical blast, gasping and blind as I neutralized him with techniques no civilian should ever have to see. Before the others realized they weren't the hunters but the hunted, I had already flipped the script. The skirmish spilled indoors. Furniture splintered, picture frames shattered, but within 20 minutes, every attacker was either unconscious or bound. One of them managed to land a knife to my shoulder during the final scuffle. It wasn't deep, but it burned a sharp reminder that I wasn't as invincible as I used to be. Alina came out of the safe room to find me in the living room, shoulder bleeding, wrapping a dish towel around the wound. Around me were 6 downed men, zip-tied and groaning. "David," she asked calmly, her eyes wide, "who exactly were you before you became my husband?" I looked at her, the woman who just endured a night that would have broken many, and realized she deserved answers. As we waited for law enforcement, Alina jumped into action, photographing weapons, recording evidence, and making sure we had everything needed to bury Richard's plans for good. She moved like someone who'd done this before, methodical, focused. I was proud of her. Those months of intimidation had forged something solid inside her. As the sound of sirens grew louder, I turned to her and said, "Alina, once this is all over, and Richard's where he belongs, there are parts of my past I've kept from you. Things I should have told you long ago." She met my eyes with the kind of strength that only grows from surviving fire. "David," she said, steady and sure, "I don't care who you used to be. What matters is who you are now. Tonight, you saved us." Her words cut deeper than any blade, but in the best way possible. That was the moment I knew no matter what else came, she and I were unbreakable. With Richard's final desperate play exposed, and me nursing a wound, the question became, would the neighborhood finally understand the truth? Or would his lies about me being unstable gain traction? Tensions were high. Who would the community believe, the charming HOA president or the quiet veteran with a mysterious past? Drop your thoughts below, because this story's only getting hotter. Sometimes, justice doesn't wait for the courtroom. Sometimes it comes right in the middle of the night, with zip ties, blood, and undeniable evidence. What unfolded in the next days would not only dismantle Richard's image but change Willowbrook forever. The police worked faster than I'd expected. Elena's files and the physical evidence we presented left no room for doubt. Richard wasn't facing some HOA slap on the wrist. He was looking at federal charges: conspiracy, attempted murder, and more. The 6 men he'd hired weren't small-time thugs. They were seasoned criminals with records a mile long, and when confronted with the possibility of life in prison, they flipped without hesitation. Their statements built an airtight case that left no question about who orchestrated everything. One detective, a seasoned veteran of military-related cases, told me this was one of the clearest criminal conspiracies she'd ever seen. The next HOA meeting was historic. The entire neighborhood showed up, eager to hear the truth. News had spread small community now tied to a federal case involving military betrayal, harassment, and a nearly deadly home invasion. Alina coordinated the meeting with help from neighbors who'd grown tired of Richard's rule. When she stood at the front of that packed room, she carried herself like someone born to lead. "We've been misled," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "Someone used our trust to settle personal scores and put lives at risk." Her words hit home. But what truly shifted the room's energy was when our elderly neighbor, the one who first warned us, stood up to speak. His voice shook with emotion, but every word was clear. "I've lived here over 3 decades, he said, "and I've never seen behavior like Richard Harrison's. What he did to David and Alina, he could have done to any of us." His story opened the floodgates. More neighbors spoke out, stories of fines, threats, and subtle intimidation. The picture they painted was undeniable. Then came Carol Jenkins, the same woman who'd helped Richard orchestrate harassment for months. With tears on her cheeks, she took the mic. Her voice trembled, but the guilt in her words was real. "I owe all of you an apology," she said. "Richard convinced me this was for the greater good. But we weren't protecting the community, we were hurting good people because he wanted revenge." Her confession shifted the entire room. When she revealed that Richard had recognized David from the moment they moved in, it shattered the last of his credibility. You could feel the crowd's temperature rise from shock to fury. Richard tried to salvage what little dignity he had left, spinning lies, painting himself as the victim, claiming PTSD made me dangerous. But no one bought it. Video footage, witness testimony, and the brutal facts crushed his defense. When he tried to say his military service gave him the right to question mine, someone in the back yelled, "Traitor," and that was it. The illusion shattered. Richard's influence vanished under the weight of his own lies. Alina was voted in as the new HOA president, unanimously. She was stunned, but I wasn't. Her calm under pressure, her vision for a better community had all made an impression. Her first act, a complete overhaul. Transparent policies, term limits, a clear separation between leadership and personal agendas. "We're going to build a neighborhood where everyone's rights matter," she said. The applause was deafening. You could feel it, the weight lifting, the relief of people finally being heard. Justice wasn't just served, it reshaped everything. And Richard, he was facing decades behind bars. His assets seized to pay restitution, including to us. The legal case wrapped quicker than expected. With the mountain of evidence and witness testimony, Richard's fate was sealed. Prosecutors made it clear. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was criminal conspiracy. His frozen accounts paid out damages for legal costs, emotional harm, and property damage. More than that, it sent a clear message. You don't get to weaponize power without consequence. No matter how small your kingdom, our home was rebuilt stronger, safer. Elena's eye for design, my background in security, it came together beautifully. Even our garden flourished with plants she picked for what they symbolized: resilience, healing, growth. The neighborhood itself transformed. Property values climbed. Monthly meetings became opportunities to connect, not fight. People started looking out for each other again. Carol, seeking redemption, became one of Elena's most trusted aides. 6 months after Richard's conviction, I stood in that new garden, coffee in hand, watching Elena add fresh flowers to a vase. I thought about how far we'd come, how much we'd lost and how much we'd gained. Elena found a strength she never knew she had, and I learned that some battles, no matter the cost, are worth the scars. She asked if I missed my old life. I paused. I miss the camaraderie, I told her, and I miss having a mission, but I wouldn't trade this life not for anything. She handed me a warm mug and we stood in the fading sunlight, quiet and at peace. When the camera rolled, I spoke from the heart. If there's one thing I want people to remember, it's this. Don't assume the quiet neighbor's weak, and never mistake peace for powerlessness, because some of us may have retired, but we haven't forgotten how to fight. Elena laughed as she walked past with a bouquet. Still telling your war stories? She teased. Just passing along some wisdom, I smiled. Heroes come in all forms sometimes. They're right next door. Richard thought we'd fold. Instead, he ran headfirst into 2 people who refused to be victims. And we weren't just surviving. We were rebuilding something better. If there's one message to take from our story, it's this. Never let fear win. Never assume the bad guys are untouchable. And never underestimate the strength of a united community. What do you think? Did I go too far, or was justice served? Let us know below. And if you loved this wild journey, don't forget to subscribe to Stories. We've got more twists, justice, and extraordinary resilience waiting just around the corner.